Guys, hi, my name's Sol Sharkey, I'm a senior, and my capstone project this year was animation. Alright, so my general research question was, what are the key concepts in creating an animated feature, and why / how do these concepts work? So, over the course of this presentation, I'll be going over specifically why, including some of the science and some of the psychology behind why these tricks and different processes work, along with going over different examples and sort of explaining my experience. So for reference, there won't be any surveys or research studies done, because a lot of this is based off not only my own research, but it's also based off a large amount of personal experience with animating and what I've found. And then those findings supported by professionals in the industry. So, quick presentation overview. For each slide, I'll cover a specific set of techniques and strategies used by animators of the past and animators of today, and going over 3 main steps with each one. So the first one, that'll be the process, me explaining what happens and how it's done. Secondly, going over historical examples and current examples, basically showing you different things you might have seen previously, or other projects you haven't seen, and explaining why those are examples. And then lastly, I'll be going over the real-world application and significance of those studies and different applications of these processes. So before I get into it, why did I choose this project? There's a lot more serious topics that I could be presenting on, but I chose to do one about cartoons. So naturally, simple enough to say, pretty much had a Cartoon Network base and never grew out of it. But additionally, my family, it's been a large part of establishing relationships with people. On a severe note, it's me and my brother, we still reference different animated shows and movies consistently, and especially during high school. For example, The Simpsons gave me a large reason to spend more time with my parents. No matter what happened during the day, no matter how busy we were, even if we couldn't talk for half an hour, we could always fit in a 20-minute episode. So, and then I'll be going over 3 different topics, generally, in regards to animation. So the first one being the anatomy and physics. So the way I like to think about this is that anatomy and physics is animation essentially complementing your brain. It's the idea that you're smart enough, you'll kind of detect weird things happening, and it'll take you out of that experience. So firstly, we're going over primary and secondary motion. So primary and secondary motion, they're kind of what they sound like. It's the idea that there are two different motions that are happening in every shot. So, for example, the primary motion is the main object, or thing that's being moved. So in the case of throwing a football, it'd be something like the primary motion would be your arm and the ball moving. Obviously, if you animate just that, and I do this, and the ball goes 100 yards, you're going to call that out. It's not going to look realistic. So that's why there's other things such as secondary motion. So in this case, it'd be the hips moving back, your arm moving back, up and down. So that way, when you see it, it starts to look more realistic, and it doesn't take you out of that experience. So, it wants to switch slides. Is the thing called exaggerated movement. So naturally, we don't live in frames per second. We are consistently moving. So this is animation's way of making up for that lost energy and time in between those frames. So for example, there's 2 things up here. One, it's commonly referred to as squat and stretch. It's the idea that if you pause a frame of animation, during an animation, it'll always look a little weird. For example, like if you're playing Foursquare or playing with any other type of ball, you'll never actually recognize the moment it hits here, because it's such a small part, but it's their way of recapturing that motion. And without it, it looks like the ball is made out of concrete rather than rubber. Additionally, this idea can apply to human emotion, with the idea that the pillow exercise says is that if you use different things, like it's hunched over or if it's elated, those can naturally convey different expressions, despite the fact that there's no actual face. So those are often included, even if it's not super necessary, and that's different ways characters can express emotion, especially if they're not humans. So then my second topic is going to be on frames per second. So this is the reason behind why animation works. You move a certain amount of frames, and then the illusion of movement is created. So firstly, I'll be going over the persistence, vision, and the phi phenomenon. These two are often confused with each other. The persistence of vision is how the illusion of animation is created. It's the idea that your brain is seeing the after images at the same rate that the previous after image is disappearing. So, for example, one of the best examples is a zoetrope, which loads. It does. So this did not show. Basically, what happens here is the ear will be spinning pictures, normally around 12, which are often played. Okay, it was a 50-50. But essentially what happens here is that you see these different frames of these two dancers dancing. And what happens is that if those are both with this different can essentially that's moving with these different frames, what happens is if you spin it fast enough, your brain is loading those after images at the same time as new images are appearing, which means there's no wasted time in between when one thing is moving to the next. Roll that there. Okay, thanks. Okay, cool. So then again, the phi phenomenon is better described as the definition of animation. It's the idea that if you move stuff in succession with each other, then the illusion of motion will be created. So secondly, there's frames per second, and what happens when you manipulate those? What's the difference between them? So as many of you can guess, the higher you get, the more fluid those move, but there's a little bit of a difference. So firstly, 12 frames per second is the standard of what you can consider to actually capture animation, to capture movement. You need at least 12 is generally considered. Otherwise, you're going to be seeing a really fast slideshow. And secondly, there's 24 frames per second. This is the industry standard. So a lot of the things you'll see are roughly around 24 to 36 frames per second. This is considered to be the most visually appealing. This is essentially like the center of the teeter totter. Because if you go to 60 frames per second, then you start seeing more after images than you're seeing current images. So naturally, your brain's starting to see stuff that was there a second ago, or what was intended to be a second ago, rather than in the current moment. So you start to see previous phases. It's kind of like if you move your hand around really fast. You know, if you're moving that faster than 60 frames per second, it gets wonky. And lastly, the one finding that I made unintentionally was the mathematical reason behind why 24 frames per second is the actual standard. And that's because there are 1,000 milliseconds in 1 second, and an after image lasts for precisely 40 milliseconds. So if you divide 1,000 by 40, you get 25 frames per second, hence creating the industry standard. And you might say, well, 25 is not 24. That's because 24 is much more easy to divide because it's an even number. So naturally, that accounted for other things, such as it lines up better with voice actors and different production costs. And then another trick that is often used and has been coming back more recently is the difference between animating on 1s versus 2s versus 3s. So this is I call it a trick because it's not necessarily anything new or a new technology, but it's the idea that you can't change how quickly something's taking photos. You can't change the speed at which the tape is being made, but there's a way to do around this with math trick where if you want to switch from, let's say, 48 frames per second to 24 without actually changing the speed of the camera, because it's very difficult to do, what you do is you copy every slide twice. So that way, something that's normally 48 frames per second switches over to 24. And recently, there's been new additions that come with some of the most popular animated movies recently, like the Spider-Verse movie, for example. A lot of these characters are actually being animated at different frames per second while still having that same motion. So they're allowed to create these comic book style feel movies instead of ones that are too fluid for the characters. And then lastly, this one sounds kind of boring, I promise it's not. It's resource and time management. So naturally, animation takes a long time to create, especially when you're trying to create something of your own work. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of people. So managing your time and resources is extremely important. So firstly, the one I'll be going over that's very common once you start looking for it is recycling. So recycling is, as it sounds, the reuse or retooling of previously animated sequences for the use of a completely new project. Oftentimes this is done by the same studio, so that way they have to do less work, spend less money. It is what it is. So Disney used to be the big culprit of this for a while. They even got back in the, I don't know how long it was, the difference between the Jungle Mowgli and the Jungle Book and Christopher Robin. They used the exact same animated sequence for a minute of the film, which mind you, when they're like not that long of films, that's a solid amount of the movie that they didn't have to actually produce. But people were so unfamiliar with animation, they got away with it. Additionally, that's still very prevalent today. One example is, I didn't watch this as much, but Pokemon was a big example. In a lot of different fighting or anything that involves this, a lot of times you'll see a character move into the background, where the background turns to something white or something blue, where it gets rid of the actual background, so they can keep pasting that same image in every time they want it to do something. So, for example, Pokemon has made literal millions off reusing their animation, and it's starting to get worse and worse. But essentially, it's most critical, and I'll be doing an example of their show, because realistically, you think, oh, well, if they can reuse their animation, how is this so prevalent? And how are people essentially getting away with turning in the same assignment twice? They really get away with it. So for example, here's sort of the math I did, including a lot of research, and this was one of the things that I took from my industry professional research, the fact that I got to survey someone and find realistic costs for why this works. So you don't have to read all this math, but essentially this was the ability to calculate how much reusing animation worked by finding the amount of seconds saved in a series, that was around 800 seconds, and then finding out how many hours it takes to produce a second of animation, which is half an hour of a 30 to 40 person team. And then lastly, seeing how much they were paid per hour, which, mind you, $13 an hour for animation for a precision skill, not much. But adding all those up together, you get the number that is kind of jarring, which is they save nearly $200,000 per season on reanimating one singular 5-second clip and reusing that every single time. And you can do the math. That over 8 series is millions of dollars that they're saving, and that's not even considering things like different production costs like voice acting that they're completely negating. And then lastly, for this, it'll be skinning and rigging. So these are two processes that are actually is actually more animation than the people that are considered animators. So Pixar has been recently on the rise for doing this, as it's the idea of creating sort of a skeleton or a computer model of your design before actually making it move. So this way, there's people that are creating new problem-solving methods towards approaching different things. Especially in the movie Coco, there's one big thing that I noticed every time my mom showed it in Spanish class, which was the fact that there's different cloth fabrics that are very important to the dresses within Mexican culture, and were very important to Dia de los Muertos, which was essentially saying that these got caught on the skeleton each time, which meant they had to create different, what they call rigs, to change that. So essentially, every single movie, they upped the ante and created a new visual experience by introducing these new rigs and skins to their characters. And then there's more examples, like I previously mentioned Coco. There's other ones from different Pixar movies, especially in the movie Soul. I didn't actually mean that to be that, but essentially in that one they made a contact rig, which meant that whenever the main character Joe played a piano, that meant that it more realistically simulated what actually playing a piano was like. And it meant that they could keep reusing that throughout the movie, despite the fact that Pixar had never produced anything like that before. And previously, the joke was that pianos weren't actually ever animated correctly, so they were the first ones to actually do that. And lastly, last one's not last, this one is global illumination. So this was a system that realistically simulates a shot of light from one specific area, not just from one central source. Those sound similar, but they're different. Essentially, it's the idea that any of you have taken design or any class where you need to learn how to draw shadows, that takes a really long time. So doing that for every frame would just be wholly unrealistic. So what they created is a system that can actively capture light and see how it reacts to other objects without having to do that for every single scene. So for example, this is what it looked like pre-global illumination. It's the idea that you have one central light source and it hits once and it stops. That's not how light works. So this is what a more realistic version of global illumination would be, where it hits on the ground and then it's back up to a larger light source. It's back up, it bounces across, so you can still see where the light is centrally hitting, but the stuff is illuminated. So that's all the main different processes, but for a general conclusion going forward, this project had a lot of different phases. Initially it was about training my own feature, then it was about the economics, and it's kind of now a mix of all of those. But going forward, I initially was planning to, I want to be an animator. Then I saw they made $13 an hour, and I was like, no. Additionally, I also saw that the different time commitments that I made didn't allow me to do so. So now I think it's really interesting because it ties a lot to different things I'm looking forward to in life, especially with the financial part. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with it right now. I'm definitely going to check in more in the future and yeah, see where I can go. Thank you guys for listening. All right, and any questions? Sabe?
How do you feel about those supposed upgraded videos of AI, putting in the frames between 24 frame rate old animation?
I was actually very close to putting something like that in my presentation. That includes sort of going back to that 60 frames per second idea, where you can actually cross over that tipping point, and it actually starts getting worse. Because if you naturally see those, you can kind of see how it's phasing over into new, and how it actually makes the animation quality somehow worse, despite the fact that it has decades of technology ahead of it. Lauren, I saw you first.
Out of all the tools and stuff you shared, do you have a favorite? You learned about it during this project?
I'd say overall the idea of creating, once again, the contact rig from the one movie, I think was really cool. It's the idea that you create new problem solving to create for each individual movie, and it makes each animated movie have a different feel and attitude towards it. That's personally my favorite.
Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Fraser, and my capstone research topic was the psychological impact of allergies. So the question that drove my research project is, how do severe food allergies impact children and their families psychologically? In this presentation, we'll mostly be focusing on the impact of severe food allergies on quality of life and anxiety and fear. So first, for some introduction and background. When I first started this project and I was brainstorming my topic, I wanted to think of things that impacted those around me, and I immediately thought of my younger brother, Elliot. My younger brother unfortunately has quite a few severe food allergies, and when he was younger, it felt like he had allergies to almost everything, from dairy products to eggs, tree nuts, peanuts, certain types of fruits, sesame, foods that seemed unavoidable. Fortunately, as he's grown up, he's outgrown many of his allergies, and I've seen how he's faced them with so much bravery. Over the years, though, I've witnessed him have a couple allergic and anaphylactic reactions, and I've seen the stress that this has put on both him and those around him, and I became interested in pursuing how this impacts others who suffer from the same thing, and became interested in also pursuing what others around them can do to help. So first, for some background on allergies themselves. So what is an allergic reaction? An allergic reaction is caused when the body mistakes a protein found within a certain food as a danger and begins attacking it. A series of chemicals is then released within the body, triggering a reaction. Allergic reactions can vary greatly in severity and can be life-threatening in some cases. It can often be easy to confuse food intolerance with food allergy, but they're actually quite different. Because food allergies impact the entire immune system, whereas food intolerance only impacts the digestive system. Some of the most common food allergies include tree nuts and peanuts, dairy products, eggs, sesame, soy, wheat, and other foods. In recent years, food allergies have actually been on the rise, increasing by 50% since the 1990s and being marked as a serious public health concern. So there's two different types of allergies, these being IgE-mediated allergies and non-IgE-mediated allergies. So this is kind of touching more on food allergy versus food intolerance. So IgE-mediated allergies lead to rapid onset symptoms such as anaphylaxis and include most of the organ systems within the body, whereas non-IgE-mediated allergies are more in that food intolerance realm. Here's kind of a chart that shows more about IgE-mediated versus non-IgE-mediated and what this means. Some of the most common symptoms of an allergic reaction include vomiting and gastrointestinal issues, hives and rashes, shortness of breath, collapse, swelling of the throat and tongue, and a weak pulse. And these symptoms can all be a part of anaphylaxis, which is a sudden reaction that is life-threatening and impacts most of the systems within the body. Anaphylaxis and the symptoms caused by it are a result of histamines being released into the body. This substance causes the blood vessels to expand, thus triggering a drop in blood pressure and heart rhythm disturbances. Anaphylaxis can be treated with the use of epinephrine, which acts in the opposite direction on the effector cells, counteracting the histamines, and can be delivered through the use of epinephrine autoinjectors, also known as EpiPens. This is an example of an EpiPen, and I include this because for lots of children with allergies, especially younger children, this can be a large source of fear and anxiety. Okay, now shifting into some quick background on the psychological aspect. In my research, I looked into how allergies impacted both anxiety and fear, and while these seem similar, they're actually quite different. So fear is a response to a perceived threat and a response to an immediate danger, whereas anxiety is a stress response about a threat that has not happened or might not ever happen. The difference between these two is quite important to note moving into the research. Okay, so for my research, I conducted 3 different methods. The first being a literature review, in which I looked at stuff already posted and studies done by professionals, and then another being a Bellarmine survey within our community, where I surveyed 15 students with food allergies, and the last being an allergist interview with an allergist at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital. So before jumping into my own research, I wanted to see what information had already been discovered about this topic. An article published in Clinical Reviews in Allergy and Immunology by Dr. Charles Bang describes the many negative psychological aspects of food allergies. He explained these to be depression, anxiety, impact of quality of life of the individual and their family. So in a study conducted, found that children with food allergies had elevated scores for coping in an anxious manner, as displayed by their vigilance in avoiding certain allergen exposures and certain foods. This avoidance can sometimes be taken to a point of social isolation and constant worry about future reactions. These children also had heightened scores for separation panic when their parents weren't around. And additionally, when a child experienced anaphylaxis, this can lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms, also known as PTSS. And in a study with 25 children with food allergies, 2 were diagnosed with PTSS and another 9 met criteria for PTSD. This cause of depression and anxiety from food allergies can stem from the stress of having a permanent chronic condition and also from the distress of parents who can sometimes be too attentive or worried. So this chart shows the impact of a child's food allergy on parents' lives. So the first displays how 61% said it had an impact on their mental health and 60% reported it had an impact on their emotional health. Additionally, mothers actually showed increased levels of stress and anxiety more than any other family members. And in a study of 46 families, mothers reported more stress and strain on their quality of life. Next, I'll be getting into the results of the survey I conducted within our Bellarmine community. So the first question that I asked was, do you feel you've been limited to your food allergies? To which 57.1% of students with allergies reported that they feel they have been limited. Noting that are quotes from some of the people that took the survey, and they reported that sometimes they felt sad or left out at certain occasions and felt they had to miss out on certain experiences. Second question that I asked was, do you feel your mental health has been impacted by your food allergies? To which 66% of students said that their mental health had been impacted. Stating, I often feel like a burden in situations where I can't eat certain foods. I feel bad when I have to turn down food or specify alterations to make me be able to eat the food. Next, I gathered more data by conducting an interview with Dr. Kaur, an allergist at Marybridge Children's Hospital here in Tacoma. Dr. Kaur works mostly with children, but has also been able to observe how parents are impacted as well. So for life impact, she reports that food allergies impact the lives of both their patients and their parents greatly, saying that there's a constant shadow of worry about accidental ingestions and future reactions. In regards to fear related to reactions, she said that this is more prevalent as children get older as they become more aware of the potential dangers. She also mentions that children become aware of having to use their EpiPen because they not only become aware of the pain, but also what follows, which is typically a trip to the ER, which is anxiety-inducing for parents and children alike. When asked about anxiety in parents, Dr. Kaur notes that this is most common in parents with younger children, especially those with common allergies that's often difficult to find alternatives for or avoid. And this constant worry about avoiding certain foods or their child accidentally ingesting an allergen puts a great amount of stress and anxiety on the parents. And finally, Dr. Kaur believes that resources and support for those with allergies is very important, however feels that there's a lack of this currently in our community. So finally, in conclusion, severe food allergies impact many aspects of children and their families' day-to-day lives. Both research within our Bellarmine community and found within the literature review reflect how food allergies can impact mental health. Food allergies can give way to kind of this cycle of fear and anxiety associated with having an allergic reaction that can lead to isolation and missed opportunities due to food and bullying, leading to higher anxiety and depression levels, overall impacting the psychological well-being and quality of life of the child and family. Moving forward, it's essential that we recognize this side of allergies that's not often considered or spoken about, and provide outlets to those with allergies by supporting them. Thank you. Yes, questions?
Well, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up an important topic, and then also too, do you plan to you seem so passionate about it and so knowledgeable based on your experience with your brother. Is this something that you intend to pursue in the future?
Yes, I think possibly in the future I'd like to pursue this. Currently I'm interested in doing something in the medical field, so this is definitely something that could apply later on. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Kylie Phillips, and my capstone topic is the fishing industry and its effects on marine life. As I just stated, my name is Kylie Phillips. I am a senior at Bellarmine Preparatory School, and I have been passionate about the ocean since a young age, so this topic felt perfect to share research with my community as well as learn more about a topic I care about. Some background information on the topic. Seafood, the term, is classified as any marine creatures we ingest. That could be crabs, fish, all the way to gooey ducks and other random creatures. Over 80% of Americans consume seafood within a 30-day period, so it is a resource that we utilize a lot, especially in the Pacific Northwest, as we have a lot of access to seafood products. In countries such as the Maldives, Iceland, and Macau, fish and seafood make up a majority of the population's diet based on what is close to them and accessible as a resource. Different fishing vessels have different impacts on the marine ecosystem, so a trawler is going to have a very different impact than a sailboat in a small-scale fishery. Some terms and definitions to know. An MPA stands for a marine protected area, so that is an area that is policed and or protected by a government of some sort, which usually that is dependent upon the authorities of the nation or government, which is in control of it. Sustainable fishing refers to legal fishing done in moderation around different areas, allowing the population to reproduce and maintain stability. Ghost gear is a term that refers to fishing gear that is intended to kill and retrieve sea life but has been discarded out to the ocean. So it is being harmful to the creatures but is no longer being retrieved. Trolling is a method of fishing where one or more boats tow a large net, which either drags across the ocean seafloor or slightly above it and collects many species of fish and anything in its path. My methods of research were student surveys in which I sent out a survey to Bellarmine students asking about the average intake of their seafood and their knowledge about said seafood. I conducted a professional interview with Perry Broderick, who is the Communications and Systems Director at Ocean Outcomes. I used secondary source research, data pulled from researchers across the field of marine biology, as well as statistics from the fishing industry and from governmental organizations. So getting into the effects of the of fishing. Contrary to popular belief, Starbucks straws do not make a majority of the ocean's waste. 50 to 100% of certain piles of ocean waste is fishing gear and ghost gear. Ghost gear, as I said, refers to anything abandoned or lost to the oceans that is often used to retrieve or kill sea life, but is discarded and no longer is being retrieved. Between 500,000 and 1 million tons of ghost gear are discarded into the oceans yearly. To put that into context, the Eiffel Tower is 10,100 tons, so that's 50 to 100 Eiffel Towers a year. That's a lot of waste. Trolling is very common. It's the 30% of our seafood comes from trolling, bottom trolling specifically. The trolling that happens that's like slightly above the seafloor is better because it's not dragging across the seafloor, whereas bottom trawl is destroying every bit of the ecosystem that it touches and collecting everything that it's destroying. This chart is probably really hard to read, but at the top it has the least hazardous type of gear, and at the bottom we have the most hazardous type. The most hazardous being a parlor trap, which you can think of like a lobster cage or some sort of cage that you would use to leave and then come back and get, but it's metal, it's sharp, it's damaging, and when discarded and not collected, it can be extremely detrimental to sea life. Kelp and natural materials like a wooden trap are clearly less hazardous because they're natural materials, they will degrade over time, and overall are less damaging. Moving into student polls and data. As a moment of self-reflection, ask yourself these questions of how much seafood you or your family consume on average, and do you check where those seafoods come from? These same questions were asked to Bellarmine students in the survey. And The results for how much seafood you consume on average, 2 to 3 servings per week made up 60% of the students, whereas less than 1 serving per month made up 40%. So most of us have seafood within the month. It's pretty common. Second question being, do you check where the seafood comes from? 20% saying yes, and the other 80 saying no or sometimes. You might be asking yourself, why does it matter where my seafood comes from? It's all from the ocean. But where and how seafood is collected and then sold makes a world of difference within promoting sustainability policies within the industry. Moving on to the interview. I got to interview Perry Broderick, who's the Communications and Systems Director of Ocean Outcomes, which works to implement science-based initiatives to make the fishing industry more sustainable. So he gave me a lot of perspective into the industry in and of itself. In this interview, I went in with a lot of pre-assumed bias on my end because when I think fishing industry hurts marine life, I think fishing industry is bad. But he helped me broaden my perspective into a more positive view of the role the fishing industry plays, while also focusing on specifics that cause the imbalance within the marine food chain. His main points when I asked about further steps in promoting a sustainable fishing system, he said looking for transparent seafood policies and products, which I'll mention later and give more specifics, sourcing products locally, and staying updated on the state of different regions of our oceans. So just keeping tabs on your area, but also just the specifics of the ocean across the world. This chart is a map of sustainable versus unsustainable fishing, and you can see we're doing pretty good. All the blue is sustainable, and then the yellow is unsustainable. So we're doing pretty good over there. But as you can see, it varies depending on parts of the ocean. And it was interesting talking about MPAs with Perry because MPAs are a very specific region of water, so it's not an entire area, but it's like a small little circle area of water. And Perry said that it's better to sustainably fish than section off parts of the ocean because the imbalance still remains if you're not protecting various areas rather than just one spot. That was a lot of negative information, so let's look at a positive side of things. There are 750,000 active fishing vessels, which sounds like a lot, and my first reaction was like, oh, that's really bad, that's a lot of carbon emissions. But 500,000 of those are non-motorized, so that's like smaller village fishing vessels, that's all over, so that's a good thing. And employment, 33 million people are employed by the seafood and fishing industry, which is a lot of jobs and a lot of good things. Some further steps, as I mentioned earlier, looking for transparent and sustainable seafood policies within markets and people selling fish. These are some labels that you will see on packaging at places like Whole Foods, Met Market, Fred Meyer, wherever you go. Even tuna has a lot of these stamps on it. So looking for transparent policies usually means they have nothing to hide, they're sourcing well, and they are organic products. It's also great to shop locally. This is a picture from Pike Place Market. I'm sure you've all been there. They have very good fish, so worth checking out. But yeah. My key takeaways, seafood is actually a very sustainable practice when done right and in moderation. And fish and seafood are a great source of food when sustainably done. Global leaders are working to enforce stricter fishing laws, but this is a difficult goal as it's somewhat unattainable. Even in MPAs, you can't just have police boats out in the ocean. That's not attainable. And small-scale fisheries are the best for the environment, and for more organic products, they're the best to go to. Thanks. Oh, questions? That one?
Why did you like ocean life so much when you were younger?
Good question. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I've always been known as a water baby. I love swimming. I love ocean creatures. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hello. My name is Owen Mickelson, and today I will be talking to you about financial limitations associated with treatment and management of schizophrenia. A little bit of background information before we really get into it. Back in 2020, I was an eighth grader in a completely new school to the it was around this time when I started to use the internet to find people who shared my common interests. Bad idea. If you're 14 on the internet, just saying. I would eventually meet someone who is going to stay anonymous for their privacy. We would talk for a while, we'd play Among Us, surprisingly. And eventually they would open up to me about their affliction being schizophrenia, which I thought was interesting. I'd never heard of it before besides the offhand joke online and the like. I was curious, so I asked them about their experience. They opened up, we had a lot of long talks and conversations, great. It was around this time that I learned about the Capstone project from my older brother, Nolan Mickelson. I thought, it'd be really cool if they did a project based around this person that I met back during COVID. Little did I know the stigmas and difficulties that surrounding the research around this topic, as we'll see later in my presentation. So first of all, my research question. How do financial barriers affect an individual diagnosed with schizophrenia and their access to care? But before we really dig into this research question, we've got to understand some terminology so we can understand the graphs later on. First really important one, you probably learned this if you're taking AP Psych, standard deviation. It's pretty much just a type of graph used to measure values related to the mean or the average of a graph. Next we've got z-scores, which have to do with standard deviation in that it's the relationship between the mean or the standard deviation of a graph and their score in relation to that mean or average. Positive indicates higher than average, while negative represents a lower than average score. Next, we're going to talk about dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's what I like to call the motivation neurotransmitter. It's like that, like you're scrolling TikTok or something and you see a funny meme and you're like, haha, funny, and then oops, 2 hours passed. Now what? Homework due tomorrow. And then suddenly all your motivation is gone and you're up till 2 a.m. doing homework. I know I've been there at least. It plays a critical role in learning and decision making, and really only knows more, it doesn't know moderation. So one of the key concepts around schizophrenia is it's based around a really high highs of dopamine and really low lows of dopamine, which cause all sorts of issues. Excess dopamine can lead to mania, breakdowns, delusions, and abnormal behavior. But a lack of dopamine really leads to a lack of motivation and willingness to do anything, kind of sluggish. So now that we know what positive and negative symptoms are, or positive and negative dopamine intake is, we're going to talk about the symptoms. Going from the top, when there's a really high of dopamine, you've got hallucinations, you're seeing things that aren't really there, hearing things that aren't really there. Disorganized thought or speech, kind of like what I'm having right now, bringing this presentation. Unusual behavior or delusions. Next we have negative symptoms when you have once again when you have a lower dopamine and your neurotransmitters aren't working quite right. You have reduced motivation or a lack of enjoyment, sometimes social withdrawal, leading to isolation and further lower dopamine. Flattened emotions, that sort of stuff, yeah. Memory and attention deficits. Dopamine plays a key role in encoding in the brain through the memory process. And having a reduced dopamine definitely hurts that process a lot. Next, we're going to talk about the process of diagnosis for schizophrenia. I did a lot of digging around online, and I really couldn't figure out a specific type of diagnosis. Usually, it involves a professional just analyzing, looking around, identifying other behaviors, ruling out other culprits, such as drug use or other mental disorders such as ADHD, ADD, that sort of stuff. Identifying key characteristics like we talked about earlier, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech and thinking, also key to that. Genetic testing is another big part of it. Schizophrenia starts in the womb and can be contributed heavily by genetics, especially those of a poorer socioeconomic status. And we're going through that, we're going to go to representation. For the most part, schizophrenia stays pretty hidden until about your mid-20s, early adulthood, late adolescence. It's around this time when you have your first, or they have their first psychotic breakdown sort of episode, and they're forced to go to a hospital to calm that down and fix that sort of issue. From there, usually there's a diagnosis and figure out what's going on, because a psychotic breakdown isn't exactly the norm. What contributes to this a lot is isolation, what we were talking about earlier with the lower dopamine, the negative symptoms. Stress and drug abuse all can contribute to this building to a psychotic crisis. As we said earlier, one of the rare ways to catch schizophrenia, but also one of the most consistent for remaining well with care, is genetic testing. But that requires care that is not accessible to everyone, especially in America. Now we're going to talk about those financial barriers that I centered my research around. But first, we got to understand why treatment matters for people with schizophrenia. As we can see, from premorbid to 20 years after onset, premorbid being like before the disease presents itself, and onset being after it's been around for a while, we can see a much lower quality of life from the healthy person at the top with the 0 Z-score, with the schizophrenic person being below that average and that quality of life. Without treatment, this sort of management of care is not feasible at all. So that's why therapy, medications, hospitalization in the most severe cases is really important. Next, we're going to talk about the cost of medications. These prices you see here are not out of pocket. They're the prices listed by the manufacturer. I think specifically this is Canadian prices, so they're probably different from US. I would love to try and tell you what these names are. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. That's outside of my pay grade, I think. But without this medication, this can lead to a lower quality of life, even from this graph, which is not the greatest, for sure. Next, we have the change in Z-score 6 months after the first psychotic episode while using these antipsychotic medicines we listed earlier. And as we can see, they take a long time to work out. Like 6 months is not enough time for them to give a sizable difference in health and standard and quality of life. So that's just another reason why it's important to keep that baseline, keep that treatment going, and keep them healthy, despite the external costs and stresses it puts upon the family. Like we said, in the most severe cases, hospitalization is required when a psychotic breakdown takes place. As we can see with this graph, right, we see the out-of-pocket costs. Not out-of-pocket cost, my bad. It's the cost to the healthcare provider. So this is, mind you, with insurance. The healthcare provider pays an amount of money, and the patient pays a lot less because of them. But in the event of an individual not having any sort of insurance, having to suddenly pay over $20,000 can be detrimental to someone's life and put them into severe medical debt for probably maybe even the rest of their life. Next, we're moving on to my research. My research methods, as we saw earlier, were all my literature review, and now we're going to move on to my interviews. I reached out to about 10 doctors, give or take, but only 2 of them responded anonymously. I would have loved to have more doctors to get more opinions on this project, but I ran into a problem. The social stigma surrounding schizophrenia. Studies have shown that schizophrenia is the most stigmatized mental illness in mental health professionals. A lot of people weren't willing to talk to me or fill out my interview form because of a lack of expertise, a lack of wanting to respond to this sort of project due to the stigma and a lot of the unknowns surrounding it. But thankfully, a few great people did help and let this project come to what it is today. To understand stigma, it comes in 3 separate phases. The first is stereotyping, or believing that schizophrenia people are incompetent, violent, or they don't have mental stability. The next is prejudice, through attitudes of fear or concerns for safety. And then next is discrimination through behavioral actions such as avoidance or flight. Stigma also directly impacts on employment, self-esteem, healthcare costs, and income negatively. This leads up to a much higher difficulty in affording care, managing stress, and remaining stable, like we mentioned earlier. The first thing I came across from my research was that individuals of lower socioeconomic status suffer the most. Family with lower household income are more likely to have schizophrenia due to a variety of factors, such as drug use during pregnancy or socioeconomic factors such as deprivation of basic needs or early life adversities, which leads to chronic stress, which then can lead to cannabis use or other drugs in serious cases. And then with this all in combination with the genetic risk can then lead to schizophrenia around late adolescent, early adult years. Next I learned, which I didn't really even think about honestly, was the treatment costs not only affect the patient itself, but the family surrounding them. 4 out of 10 caregivers for patients with schizophrenia feel that they lack the ability to cope with the immense stress that results from caretaking. Combining this with the financial burden, potential lack of support, and damage to the caregiver's social circles, it's important to remember that schizophrenia affects more than just the patient, but the family dramatically. One of the main ways schizophrenia contributes so highly to the costs across the world is the inability to take care of oneself on their own, especially in the event of a psychotic breakdown. Whether it be financially, socially, physically, the cost of caregiving ends up being around 3 times more than the cost of the medical visits for people with schizophrenia. It ends up being about 2.5% of national healthcare expenditures. Next, we're going to go into the global costs per year. So the USA, right there. It's really small, I'm sorry, but it's separated into direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are directly tied to the government, such as healthcare costs for medications, hospital visits, and non-healthcare costs, such as social services, lodging, in the event travel is required to see a specialist. Indirect costs are tied directly to the family of the patient specifically, such as patient's lack of ability to work, caregiver costs, and other such expenses, such as disability. From a global perspective, you can see all the way at the right, the US is spending about $55,000 in 2022, adjusting for inflation. That adjusts to be about 100K, give or take, which is major considering schizophrenia is extremely rare, as it is for mental illness. Some final thoughts. Although schizophrenia is a rare disease, people shouldn't count it out, and its impact is detrimental across the United States. The world as a whole needs to do more to accommodate both patients and families with this issue. So what can you do to help? Some calls to action are spreading awareness, talking to other people about this issue, and teaching them about what you can do to help. Donating to charities such as Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance, or the Schizophrenia International Research Society. And the final option is to further educate yourself. The first way you want to support anyone is learning and interacting with them. The internet is a great source to learn more, but just make sure to check for bias. That's really important nowadays. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much for all of that information. And I noticed from your first slide, you said that you were thinking about potentially studying psychology. Do you think that might, like, at the end you talked about different organizations. Do you think that there might be some pairing between those two things for you in your future? Like, is that what you're leaning towards?
It's definitely an option for me. I would love to volunteer or get a job at one of those organizations maybe over the summer just to check things out, examine the field, learn what I want to learn before I fully commit.
Yeah, that's really awesome.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Josephine Coons, and my research project is on the relationship between weight stigma and healthcare on individual maladaptive health habits. Like I said, my name is Josephine Coons. I'm 17 and I'm a senior here at Bellarmine. My passion for this topic is rooted in my own personal experience with an eating disorder, especially pertaining to the fact that while I was receiving care for this disorder, I was never severely underweight or treated as such by healthcare professionals. And it's really important to recognize the difference in level of care and in regards to severity of an eating disorder, and how there's often a bias that it is only severe if you are severely underweight, which often causes a lot of issues for people who do struggle with eating disorders and leads to them not getting adequate care. So this is kind of talking about the social aspect of how weight stigma in healthcare impacts an individual. From previous research shows that negative attitudes towards obesity in healthcare settings are associated with a 19% higher risk of patients not adhering to medical advice given by their physicians due to a lack of trust between the patient and the doctor. And it has also shown that patients also experience increased weight gain when being told to lose weight, or when doctors show negative attitudes towards individuals in larger bodies. So what this research was really looking at was how does weight stigma impact an individual in their own health habits. So specifically 2 factors that I was looking at were weight stigma, how it impacts drive for thinness, and gym avoidance. So weight stigma is the discriminatory act and ideologies targeted towards individuals because of their own weight or size. And oftentimes, lots of people will have experienced some form of weight stigma in their experience with healthcare providers, but it's often disregarded, and people don't understand that although doctors have lots of education, they can be wrong, and that there needs to be more research done about how weight does directly impact an individual's health. One of the factors that I was looking at was drive for thinness. And drive for thinness is a scale used by the eating disorder inventory, and it is a desire to be thinner, not a desire to be objectively thin. So this is an important distinction between the two, given the fact that drive for thinness is a perpetual state of mind where an individual can feel like they need to consistently become smaller and smaller, and this can be fatal in many cases. And the other aspect that I was looking at was gym avoidance, and this is a type of experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance is characterized by a person's avoidance of an uncomfortable thought, feeling, or situation. Gym avoidance tends to be more common in higher weight individuals as a result of general weight discrimination that is central in a lot of gyms and facilities that are centered around like physical well-being. So the methods that I used for my research was I conducted an anonymous survey that I sent out in my Instagram story and to my peers at Bellarmine. I got 47 responses from both male and females, around most people around the ages of between 13 and 16. The measures that I used were, this is the weight stigma subscale taken from the everyday discrimination scale. This is a scale that was created by Dr. Williams, and this is something that is used to, as you can see, analyze what kinds of discrimination an individual will face. I took this scale here and applied it to what might happen in a medical facility. That being said, I just swapped out some of the wording. So be frequently treated with less courtesy than other patients, or receiving poorer service than other patients, to tie it directly to medical experiences. This is the other measure that I used. This is the drive for thinness subscale taken from the eating disorder inventory. And these are all on a scale from 3 to, there's multiple zeros, but yeah. There's 7 questions regarding an individual's motivation to become thinner, regarding certain macronutrients in foods, thinking about dieting, thinking about how weight might impact their life, and over-magnifying the importance of weight in their life. And then the last measure that I used was the gym avoidance subscale. This is taken from the social exercise and anxiety measure scale, and this is rated on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being not like me at all, and 7 being completely like me, summed together to find an average. So this is an example of one of the questions from my survey. It says, you are treated with less courtesy or respect than other patients. As you can see, many people from the survey said no, they did not at all experience being treated with less courtesy or respect, which was expected. Which was expected from the population that I sent my survey out to. This is another example of a question I used for the drive for thinness portion of my survey. And this is an example question from my gym or exercise avoidance portion of my survey. So here are the results that I got. So I ran a simple linear regression on an online computer program, and a simple linear regression found no significant association between weight stigma and drive for thinness, such that higher weight stigma did not predict a greater drive for thinness. However, there are some important factors that this is probably a little difficult to understand, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. So this value right here is the positive p-value, and this indicates the relationship is not statistically significant despite showing that there is some positive relationship between weight stigma and drive for fitness. Additionally, the standard estimate value tells you how wrong the regression model is, and on average, using units of the response variable should fall within plus or minus 2 of the original value. The value here is 2.57, which boasts confidence of this regression model's accuracy. Moving on, the second linear regression I ran regarding weight stigma and gym avoidance shows that there was a significant association between greater gym avoidance and experiencing weight stigma in healthcare, such that individuals were more likely to avoid physical exercise in public settings after experiencing stigma from their medical providers. So this data tells us that individuals who experience greater weight stigma in the survey experience greater gym avoidance. However, they did not experience a greater drive for thinness. My initial hypothesis was a bit contrary to what my findings were. I was expecting there to be a greater drive for thinness when individuals experienced weight stigma, and I think these results came out the way they were because drive for thinness is much more complex than a simple behavioral avoidance of a place, and it is much more, it's perpetual and something that continues, and therefore would be harder for an individual to make an immediate switch to after experiencing weight stigma in their own personal lives. Why this matters? This matters because it is representative of how weight stigma in healthcare can impact an individual's life. Oftentimes, individuals that go seek medical attention who are in smaller bodies will receive more accurate, proper diagnoses and will receive more in-depth care. Whereas individuals who are in larger bodies will often be seen as lazy, or doctors will completely brush under a rug previous health concerns and immediately assume things are correlated to an individual's weight, which can lead to later health concerns, lower self-esteem, and can cause an individual to develop disordered habits, which could precipitate into a severe eating disorder. So I had an interview with, actually, this was the dietitian I had when I was going through my treatment, and I asked her a couple questions about how maybe there could be changes in the medical field. She is a registered dietitian at Multicare, and what I got from Dr. Lovejoy was that she said that if we could start over, doctors should look more at health habits rather than the statistics of an individual's BMI or an individual's weight, because health habits are something that are used over time and can actually be more introspective to an individual's overall health and well-being rather than simple numbers. Additionally, health habits make individuals healthy, not their weight, which is a common misperception, and especially in Western medicine, fat is immediately seen as unhealthy, which is not true, and there are a multitude of factors that do play into health that exclude weight. And then lastly, she recommends that lifestyle practices are what make up a majority of an individual's health. What people eat and how they move not regarding macronutrients particularly or counting calories, but just focusing on getting the energy your body needs and moving so your body feels good. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you. Any questions? No questions? Okay. Oh. Question?
So you said that, can you go back to your slide, that race stigma,
Which slide?
the one with the linear regression, or the conclusion. That one. Individuals experience greater weight stigma and greater gym avoidance. So that's an interesting finding, with the small end of the survey that you got. Would you say, how would you correlate that, or what would you tell the providers who care for younger people, how to talk to the patients with bigger bodies, or about how to discuss health, health habits, or so that they can achieve some of their goals, their health goals?
Well, I think it's very important to take the focus off of an individual's weight, and instead of a doctor telling a patient that they should go to the gym or work out so that the goal is to lose weight, rather the focus should be on making an individual feel like movement is so that they feel good for themselves and not to get to a smaller number or to be a smaller size in jeans. But I think the emphasis needs to be shifted away from calories and pounds and more to, like Dr. Lovejoy had recommended, lifestyle practices and daily health habits. Thank you.
Contrary to the iPad name, I'm not Matthew Hillier. I'm Christopher Silverthorne. And I'm happy to speak to you all about my slide that's showing up real good. Let's just go back a bit, maybe it'll come up. Yes! Okie dokie. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about the legality of solitary confinement and how it fits into the United States government laws. All of my parents are lawyers, and they have been ever since I was a kid, so I have always had an idea of how our legal system works and how our legal system fails people. I also from them got a very black and white sense of justice, so when I see injustices in the world, I have a hard time just letting them sit. One of the injustices that I came across in my life was the idea of solitary confinement. This idea was so contrary to everything I had understood, everything I knew. I couldn't fathom this complete and total isolation. So I decided to do my capstone topic on it, even though it seems to contradict with what I want to do in life, math, science major. I think that criminal justice is an area that needs a lot of attention. My research question is, does solitary confinement adhere to the restrictions surrounding prisons outlined in the Constitution and other legislative works? So we're all on the same page. Some vocabulary terms. Restrictive housing is the building in which solitary confinement cells are located. It is a place. Solitary confinement is a condition. And according to the Nelson Mandela rules, which are these big rules for the world on how prisoners should be treated, solitary confinement is 22 hours or more a day in a restrictive housing cell. But within this presentation, we're going to refer to solitary confinement as the placement of an individual in a restrictive housing cell for any period of time. The two types of solitary confinement are max custody and administrative segregation. Max custody is what we think of as a custody level for prisoners who spend all or almost all of their prison term in a solitary confinement cell. And administrative segregation is the corrective tool that you might be familiar with, where an individual, maybe they get in a fight, maybe they've broken a rule, they've caused some sort of problem in a prison, and they're put in solitary confinement for a short period of time. Solitary confinement began way back in the 1820s with the Quakers, actually, in Pennsylvania. The Quakers believed that if they put someone in solitary state, they would think about what they had done and they would be sorry for their wrongdoings. Immediately, this showed negative mental and emotional effects, and the Quakers dropped it, and they were like, no one should ever do this, so the government started doing it. In the 19th century, or in the 20th century, you have the first use of solitary confinement against political dissidents in the first Red Scare. You had a lot of people who were thought to be communists because of any of their actions put in confinement. More recent examples, you can see Black Panthers, feminists, and sustainability advocates put in solitary confinement because their particular political views could be a threat to prisons, is what was seen. So now we're all going to do a little activity together. Promise I won't make you meet new people. I want you to think about your day up to this point. Try to count every person that you've interacted with. Consider your interactions, talking to someone, handing them something, waving to them in a hall. Don't consider things like the people who work on a different floor than you and you didn't see them all day. Take a minute and think. How many of you have an exact right number? How many of you have a ballpark? Everyone put your hands up. Get a ballpark. Put your hands down if it's less than 10 people. Less than 20 people. 30, 40, 50, 70, 100. There we go. Okay, now we're going to think about our days exactly as you just did. You're going to go through all the steps, you're going to wake up, eat your Wheaties, do whatever you do. But now, you are the only person in the world. All of your activities are the same, but there's no one else. This gets kind of eerie, but it's a doable thought process. One last time, you're going to do all your activities in a room about the size of a queen-size bed. You're going to have no windows or clocks to sense the passage of time, and you will be completely dependent on an outside force. Some of you may be having a really hard time with this imagination. It is really difficult to see yourself in this situation for more than a couple hours, let alone to imagine days in this condition. That is because humans are inherently social creatures, and this form of isolation goes exactly against what our brains and our bodies are made for. Okay. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to the following people that I conducted interviews with. Justin Brooks is a criminal defense attorney, law professor. He founded the California branch of the Innocence Project, and he works to get people on death row who are wrongly convicted off. Jeribu Hill is a lawyer. She's the founder of the director of the Mississippi Worker Center for Human Rights, where she works with people in lower socioeconomic statuses who face discrimination. And before that, she worked as a legal intern for the Constitutional Center, where she worked on very famous cases of people whose rights had been deprived in solitary, like Tupac's stepdad, Mutulu Shakur. John Campbell is the Senior Director for Comprehensive Case Management in Washington. He oversees solitary confinement, and he's actually just about retired. And finally, Rain Kurai is a prison psychologist at the Washington Correction Center for Women. She has worked there for 15 years. She works with people assigned to max custody and those who are in some form of confinement. We're going to begin with the 8th Amendment, which states excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Most of the presentation is going to revolve around this amendment. There are many side effects of solitary confinement that one might not think about, or especially the people who are perpetrating this activity. The first is a loss of the ability to function. We're going to look at two case studies. The first is Terry Anderson. He is a journalist who was kidnapped in Beirut and held hostage for 7 years by the Hezbollah. He was moved frequently and often held in solitary confinement, sometimes held with other prisoners. When in confinement, he could feel his mental faculties degrade significantly. He found himself brooding, very emotional, quick to anger, obsessive over his cell, neurotic to many degrees. He famously said, "The mind is a blank. Jesus, I always thought I was smart. Where are all the things I learned, the books I read, the poems I memorized? There's nothing there, just a formless gray black misery. My mind's gone dead. God help me." Frank Reed was also held by the Hezbollah, and in fact, Mr. Anderson and Reed were both held together. When they were held together and when he was held with other prisoners, Terry Anderson saw some of his mental faculties come back. He was held with only a Bible, and he was able to read 2 sentences back to back, which he had not been able to do prior. Frank Reed, when he was held with Terry Anderson, was actually in a much worse state. He was semi-catatonic. He would sit at the ground and stare at the wall for hours, never moving, which often led to abuse from the guards around him for not listening. When he was released by the Hezbollah, he was admitted into a psychiatric hospital. And that's a picture of Terry Anderson. Charles Hopkins is another case study. He is someone who was held in an American prison. A very scary thing is that people held in American prisons have the same symptoms that people held by terrorist organizations or prisoners of war can have. In addition to his inability to function, Charles Hopkins, who prefers the name Mansa Musa, faced a severe loss of identity. Arrested at 17 for petty theft while addicted to drugs, he was sentenced to life in prison. Pretty fair. He served about 48 years. During his stay in prison, he read a lot of books about civil rights, particularly those written by Black Panthers, where he adopted his Black Panther mentality and chose the name Mansa Musa. Because of his newfound political ideals, he was held in solitary confinement for 4.5 years. He now co-hosts a show since his release from prison called Rattling the Bars, and on this show he stated that the worst part was the total dependence on others to tell you what to do, when to eat, when to go outside even though it rarely happened, everything until you became the number that they called you. The most familiar symptoms that we may be with solitary confinement are the psychotic symptoms that can go. Medical reviews across the board show increased mood and thought disorders after stays in restrictive housing. The graphic, a part of a systematic review, shows the adverse effects of solitary and the association between inmate exposure to solitary and the mean difference for individual health symptoms. As you can see, the psychological and psychotic symptoms are prevalent and various. Many of these studies, these are all studies that they combined, have similar side effects. Anxiety, depression, and thought disorders are all throughout. These symptoms can get better over time. The one that does not get better, unfortunately, is the anger and hostility that increases with solitary confinement. So essentially, by putting someone in a restrictive housing cell, we give them more anxiety, depression, an inability to cope with social issues, and then increased anger and hostility, which explains why many people returned to administrative segregation once they were released back to general population. Justin Brooks, the founder of the California the Innocence Project, stated in an interview that all of his clients suffer from some form of PTSD. Jeribu Hill corroborated this by saying that her clients described the horrific conditions of solitary that caused emotional trauma, triggered hallucinations, mental diseases, like talking to yourself and hearing voices. One that's unknown is that solitary actually causes a lot of physical health problems. As I stated, humans are inherently social creatures, so the lack of contact with other people is physically strenuous, which increases blood pressure and heart disease for all people, even young people with no prior causes or inclinations toward heart disease. Mortality also increases because of heart disease and also suicide. Unfortunately, as you can see in the graphic here, the unnatural causes is 2 times as much as normal heart failure, so individuals are much more likely to commit suicide in solitary. Solitary poses a huge threat to individuals, which is why it's actually never been officially overturned because it's an individual case. But I would like to quote that the institution itself provides so many opportunities for corruption that it is a threat to all people in prisons. In her work as a legal intern for the Constitutional Center, Jaribu Hill witnessed people like Matulu Shakur, Albert Woodfox, and Salim Holbrook be deprived of their rights to doctors, to see family, to lawyers, and sometimes repeatedly beaten. None of these things are documented because the individuals were in solitary and there were no witnesses. John Campbell, the director for comprehensive case management in Washington, did state to me that he has no knowledge of individuals who were denied access to medical care or lawyers, which is a good thing, but it is probably not a comprehensive statement giving the systematic prevalence of these things. And the reasons for being put in solitary are wide and various, and they can not always be applied fairly. Race, political issues, economic standards, the way that you were raised all comes into solitary confinement. If you were not raised with the ability to take in a situation, calm yourself down before you react, you're more likely to lash out at prison guards or prisoners in a situation where you are put under a lot of stress. To summarize this symptom, Rain Karai, prison psychologist, does it quite well. Trauma symptoms combined with the environment of prison can create a problematic combination of escalating behaviors which can lead to the conditions of solitary confinement, which then further heightens trauma symptoms. Moving on to Supreme Court cases. In our government, Supreme Court cases allow us to fully understand the Constitution and apply it to modern day scenarios. We'll be looking at 2 cases, the first being Hudson v. McMillan in 1992. In this case, Keith Hudson claimed that he was beaten by 2 prison guards while their supervisor watched. He did not have severe bodily injury, but he argued that even because of that, the emotional and detrimental mental side effects that he received from the beating was cruel and unusual. And obviously the opposition argued that that was not there. The Supreme Court ruled that the psychological effects can constitute a violation of the cruel and unusual punishment, and you do not need to display significant bodily harm. This allows us to say that mental effects from solitary confinement are cruel and unusual. Second is Estelle v. Gamble, 1976. J.W. Gamble was working in a prison in Texas when he was injured by a bale of cotton. He went to see the infirmary. They cleared him, gave him an Advil, and he refused to go back to work. This landed him in solitary confinement. Over a period of 3 months, bouncing in and out of restrictive housing and the infirmary, Gamble was seen 17 times before being diagnosed with high blood pressure. Gamble claimed that the prison doctors ignored his medical condition, while the Supreme Court determined that in his case, doctors weren't negligent, but negligence to a serious illness or injury is cruel and unusual. Because the adverse psychological effects of solitary confinement are so well documented, it is possible to say that no one in a prison system is aware of this, therefore their indifference to it is cruel and unusual punishment. In Washington, we do have the opportunity for prisoners to see a psychologist like Rain Karai, and that is how we say we are not indifferent. But because solitary confinement and prisons are not regulated federally, we have state prisons. States can decide what is or is not an application of this court, which can lead to a prisoner in 2 different states having severely different prison sentences and living out the rest of their life in completely different manners. I don't know how to fix that. Thank you. Sure, yes. So my 4th point is going to be the international laws of torture, specifically the Nelson Mandela rules. The Nelson Mandela rules are the UN standard minimum for the treatment of prisoners. States that prisoners in restrictive housing are afforded the rights to health care. Washington State, like I said, does a fairly good job of regulating solitary confinement. John Campbell states that there are access to mental health professionals for all held in restrictive housing, and there are treatment plans that they can go through that teach them about anger and appropriate responses. The Nelson Mandela rules also state that prisons should alleviate the detrimental side effects of confinement. These programs that I mentioned can help alleviate the detrimental side effects. However, psychologist Ray Karai believes that they are little to no help. Unfortunately, particularly for women, because they're more likely in a prison, their pathways to crime are more likely trauma-based, and these programs mostly deal with responses to stressful situations and anger, and less the undergrown trauma. As such, treatment regarding these underlying trauma conditions is the most needed form of treatment in order to alleviate detrimental side effects. Almost done. The right to visitation is also prescribed in the Nelson Mandela rules. Solitary in itself provides a reason for prisons to deny visitation, even to people's lawyers and families, saying that they're currently dangerous, they're currently aggravated, and you cannot see them. The Mandela rules also require cultural recreational activities to be provided to prisoners. Currently, John Campbell heads the Solitary Confinement Transition Program, which is going to make Washington State a much better place to go to prison. However, there's only so much you can do when it's not federally regulated. Federal regulations. The Mandela rules state that administrative segregation and prolonged solitary confinement is subject to the regulation of the federal government. The Mandela rules are non-binding, but they are an example of how a developed country should behave. The United States prides itself on its equitability and development, and yet we do not adhere to international regulations. We do not federally regulate a situation that is detrimental to every individual who is put in it, which is a growing number of individuals. The level of struggle needed to change an oppressive system like a prison is immense. The consistent and constant pressure needed to help prisons change is massive. It will take all of us to change an ingrained system like this. And I hope to sort of start that process with all of you today. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
So with this information out there in public, do you think the government would ever do anything to stop solitary confinement?
So it's going to have to begin at a state level. Washington State is doing a really good job. John Campbell and his transition program have helped many prisons. They started at Walla Walla, and I think by this time he's done 2 or 3. There's 5 max custody prisons in Washington, and we're almost there. A lot of things like constitutional amendments can begin at the state level, so I think it's going to take petitioning, state representatives, and voters like you all to make a change in our state, neighboring states, to eventually get 26 states on board. Yes?
So you mentioned previously that different previous prisoners had then gone
So some conditions are irreversible, like the anger and hostility that can stay with an individual for their entire life. Things like PTSD can be treated in psychiatric facilities. However, as you can see with war vets or other people who have a lot of trauma, it doesn't always work. There is hope for those who have been in solitary confinement. There are transition programs out there, but again, they don't focus on the trauma-based symptoms, and they often aren't effective to the highest degree, but they aren't ineffective. Any last words? Thank you all. Sorry, Katie.
So, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for sticking around to watch my presentation. It's been a marathon. I thank you so much for taking your time to watch all of this as well. And my name is Catherine Palmerter, and I chose to conduct my research on homelessness in the Tacoma-Seattle area and why solutions and initiatives have proved unsuccessful to help the issue. My official research question was, why are homelessness solutions and initiatives unable to reduce the number of persons living in poverty in our area, and how does it connect to mental health care institutions? So personally, homelessness has been a social problem that particularly piqued my interest from a young age. I partially grew up in the Seattle area and have witnessed before my eyes how the population of homeless people has increased rapidly over the past 10 years. And as someone who's always been and remains very interested in politics, this issue is becoming increasingly pertinent with our elections and with new politicians coming into practice with new ideas for how we're going to address this. Also, policy around healthcare funding and the treatment of those who are homeless will define the future of this issue. And I wanted to get a further understanding of this within a policy context. Finally, homelessness is an issue that my family has continued to stay focused on throughout time, and I've been raised with an emphasis on exercising empathy and understanding for those struggling, especially when we meet and witness the homeless population in our area. So, first I would like to set some context around homelessness in Washington State. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, King County, Washington currently ranks third in the nation for the number of people experiencing homelessness. Seattle sits only behind Los Angeles, California, and New York in the sheer number of people living on the streets. A part of the issue is that affordable housing construction is not meeting the needs of homeless population here in Washington State, especially in the greater Seattle area. Plans to construct housing are unable to handle the rapidly increasing population of homeless persons in our area, as more than 16,000 people were reported to be experiencing homelessness on a given day in King County in the 24-point-in-time count. This is a 23% increase since 2022 alone, and that number is only, that percentage increase is only much bigger from, let's say, 10 years ago. Homelessness isn't only on the rise in our area, and as it rises dramatically, our communities are unequipped and unwilling to support those newly facing poverty and unable to afford housing in an ever-worsening economy. I will use these 4 terms in my presentation, and I would like to give some clarification as to their exact meaning within the context of my project. When I say severe mental illness, I am referring to mental disorders which inhibit one's ability to maintain a stable baseline of adult functionality. The illnesses may include severe bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, and numerous forms of substance abuse and addiction. These are some examples of illnesses which may cause someone to be unable to hold a stable job, maintain adult relationships, or communicate with their family. Western State Hospital, or Western State as I will call it throughout this presentation most likely, is Washington State's largest and only long-term inpatient mental health care facility. They are the only institution equipped to care for patients for longer than 90 days and often hold patients for periods of years or decades. They recently became a strictly forensic hospital and now only care for patients who are facing or have faced criminal charges, meaning that many of their patients who had been in their custody for large periods of time are now unable to be cared for. Also, the Involuntary Treatment Act, or ITA, is a legislative framework for hospitals to hold patients without patient approval. If the hospital successfully petitions the court for an ITA, they can hold the patient for 14 days before a reevaluation of patient status for the possible 90 days. Conditional release is a practice by inpatient mental facilities in which newly discharged patients are observed in the community for behaviors similar to those monitored in a hospital setting. If patients are unable to meet the conditions of the release and maintain a stable baseline, they are meant to return to the hospital, though as I will speak about later, this often is uneven. I wanted to share some primary issues around mental health care access in the greater Washington state area. According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the share of adults in need of mental health care with private insurance is 4% lower than the national average. Many outpatient mental health care facilities strictly accept private insurance, a resource that many Washington residents do not currently have access to. Additionally, nearly half of all Washington counties do not have a single working psychiatrist. Though Seattle and Tacoma have numerous mental health care facilities, many counties in eastern Washington have little to no access to mental health care outside of online resources. Lack of mental health care access and infrastructure can be directly linked to homelessness. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation has found that at minimum, 25% of the homeless population is severely mentally ill, while 45% has any mental illness. People with poor mental health are more susceptible to the three main factors that lead to homelessness, which is poverty, disaffiliation, and personal vulnerability. Seeing as Washington state is currently facing a mental health care crisis, homelessness seems to be rising proportionally. I also wanted to share some information about restrictions on mental health care in our area and limitations on accessing resources in the home. According to the Bureau of Health Workforce, Health Resources, and Service Administration, 16.2% of mental health care needs are met in Washington state, compared to a national average of 27.7%. Despite a potency of psychiatrists in our area, only a minuscule portion of those facing mental illness are able to access resources due to numerous roadblocks, like insurance, transportation, and other health issues, and social safety. Additionally, in 2018, the Washington State Medical Association stated that Western State would lose $15 million of federal funding. As I mentioned earlier, Western is the singular institution in our area and the entire state that is able to provide long-term care. The cuts in funding due to lapses in health code procedures, the issues with mental health care at their facility are only increasing, even forcing them to accept strictly forensic patients for capacity purposes. Conditional release is widely practiced by inpatient mental health care institutions, but rarely utilized properly due to lack of resources and prioritization. For conditional release to be executed correctly, hospitals heavily depend on departments of correction, community corrections officers, to monitor patients and contact officials if they are displaying unsafe behavior. These corrections officers are majorly overworked and understaffed, working to maintain a system they are uneducated and unprepared for. Conditional release majorly never leads to reinstitutionalization, as officers cannot and do not identify behaviors that necessitate Another reason that I partook in this presentation is because my father, who's actually sitting behind you right now in that blue shirt, and he's going to be mad that I had all of you look at him, is a psychiatrist actually at Wellfound just down the hill. And he's been a psychiatrist for the entirety of my life, in the Navy, and now does inpatient care here. And the two of us have had a lot of really informational and long-form conversations about this topic, and it is something that I continue to really just want to educate myself more heavily on, because he really kind of inspired me to take up this issue and take up being concerned about people in our lives and people he cares for and how they are chronically experiencing homelessness because they don't have access to the mental health care that he hopes to provide. Okay. Johnson v. Grant past Supreme Court decision allows cities to ban people from sleeping or camping in public spaces. This ruling states that local government ordinances, with civil and criminal penalties for camping on public land, do not constitute cruel and unusual punishment of homeless people. Legislation similar to this criminalizes the act of being homeless without considering to create or pass legislation to help those facing homelessness from continuing to have to camp on the streets. Moreover, the Washington Department of Commerce invested $313 million in affordable housing this March through a housing trust fund. Housing trust funds provide capital financing through loans and grants to affordable housing projects who must compete in application cycles for funding. The competitive process to access this money allocated for home construction can often cause long-term holds in project progress, as groups constructing affordable housing must reapply for funding annually. Since 2013, Washington has put $3.4 billion into preventative homelessness programs. In accordance with a study from the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, persons who have been unhoused before are more likely to face homelessness again in the future, as it is more difficult to obtain housing if you have documented stints of being unable to support rental payments. Preventative programs include things such as rental and utility assistance, as governments attempt to stop persons from sliding into homelessness instead of aiding those already facing homelessness. Additionally, the portion of the document recording fee is split among a range of issues, including housing plans, rent assistance, incentives for landlords, and maintaining supportive housing. Seeing as myself, and probably no one here knows what a document recording fee is, because what is that? The fee is a small charge of auditors and the state to file real estate deeds, death certificates, order changing name, and more. So it's just a little bit of money, but it is going towards homelessness. So continuing to talk about the efforts to help homelessness in our area, there are many active groups in our community in supporting abating the homeless population. The groups I'm about to cover are specific to Tacoma, but similar organizations also exist in Seattle and on a statewide scale. The Tacoma-Pierce County Coalition to End Homelessness is focused on connecting people and organizations who can take action to end homelessness. Instead of being a singular nonprofit, they are a network of individuals, organizations, government agencies, faith-based groups, and businesses in our area. The Reach Center is a partnership program of Tacoma Community House, and they provide individualized case management support for persons ages 12 to 24 dealing with homelessness. Tacoma Rescue Mission is an organization many people in here would be familiar with, even just tonight because you've probably heard about it from Lexi. And they are actively helping Bellarmine students get involved with helping this issue, as well as helping the larger Tacoma community. They do numerous things to help the homeless population in our area, including providing clean living apartments, maintaining a thrift store, and serving. Last, Tacoma Housing Authority produces and maintains housing for low-income persons and families in our area. With 1,300 dwelling units in Tacoma, they can provide shelter to all shapes and sizes of families and communities. Also, Seattle updated its encampment outreach response from the navigation team to the Hope team, and this team is constructed of 8 people coordinated with city outreach teams and departments, engaging with people in Seattle facing homelessness and connecting them with an ecosystem of social services that they need. A similar movement in Just Care is increasingly active in the Seattle area. Just Care was created as a response to rising poverty levels after the COVID-19 epidemic, and it has begun to overshadow.
Guys, I apologize. I'm really nervous. It's been a really long night.
Created as a response to rising poverty levels after the COVID-19 epidemic, and continues its work in Seattle, even as the pandemic and its effects have begun to be overshadowed by other issues. Finally, Governor Inslee's 2023 to 2025 Housing and Homelessness Package was released in late 2022, and we are seeing as the ideas outlined come into practice. A cornerstone of the governor's housing plan was a referendum allowing legislators to front-load $4 billion of housing construction until 2028. I spoke to 4 professionals that are all listed up here on the screen, who are professionals in the areas of mental health care and housing support in our area. Their names, when talked to and tasked with questions concerning why all the efforts to aid and prevent homelessness are unsuccessful. I ultimately received similar answers from each of my interviewees, but I've opted to share highlights of these interviews with you while also providing brief analysis and some major takeaways.
This great image of my house.
conversation with Dr. Palmer, we discussed the quantity of his patients who, when admitted, are currently homeless or have been homeless for a significant period of time. He ultimately shared with me that the vast majority of the people on his unit are homeless and will likely be discharged to a shelter or group home, hopefully ending the period of homeless that they've had. Deeper into this conversation, we spoke about the sheer number of homeless people in our area who he can directly identify as struggling with severe mental illness and in need of hospitalization or long-term care. When I posed the question, if you believe that the majority of chronically homeless people are in need of psychiatric hospitalization or long-term care, why are they not currently hospitalized? He said the following. There are simply not enough psychiatric beds in the whole state of Washington. Patients often have to be transported upwards to 100 miles to find a hospital with space for them if they can find space at all. He explained to me that law enforcement or individuals will often come to the emergency room intending to admit someone for severe mental illness, but the individual will instead be faced with waiting in the ER for days or weeks, waiting for a bed to open at a psychiatric facility. Though sometimes this waiting period will yield a spot opening and transportation to the facility for care, some patients have to be discharged from the hospital before they are ever able to access the care they need. Many homeless people are in need of mental health care that they are unable to access due to a sheer capacity limit here in Washington State and throughout the country. During my conversation with Dr. Hernandez, she brought up another issue that limits the care that hospitals can give to patients once they have been admitted. The doctor said, all of the doctors and ARNPs spend significant time on the phone with insurance companies. Convincing insurance to cover patients staying in the hospital is often very difficult. All three doctors I spoke to mentioned that the difficulty that insurance can cause in caring for their patients. Physicians are hired by insurance companies to consult cases and determine if a patient still necessitates inpatient care, and these physicians then speak with the doctors at hospitals about if the insurance company will continue to support a patient's hospitalization in the long term. Dr. Hernandez and Palmer both shared the same sentiment that the insurance companies are on the side of affordability and not patient care, often asking providers at their hospital to discharge their patient when they are still showing signs of suicidality and a lack of confident baseline. When insurance agencies refuse to support the care that hospitals hope to provide, patients will be discharged before they can be adequately medicated and treated. Many patients who are prematurely released from hospital care are on public Medicaid insurance and either facing severe poverty or homelessness currently. When discharged, they will hopefully find solace at a shelter, but are much more likely to return to living on the streets. If insurance companies cannot financially support psychiatric institutions in caring for patients, the population in need of care will never meet the baseline that needs to be reinstated for long-term success and competent function. During all of my interviews, the 4 topics listed on the screen were addressed by the professional I spoke to. Access to long-term mental health care institutions in Washington State is all but non-existent. Now that Western State has officially ceased taking non-forensic patients, persons in need of long-term observed mental illness support are unable to access that care. Lacking this resource can be directly linked to the chronic homelessness for some Washington residents, as they are unable to maintain a stable baseline without care provided by a long-term psychiatric institution. The prevalence of drug addiction in the homeless and mentally ill population was also mentioned in the interviews. Seeing as opioid and narcotic usage and their effects on severe mental illness are quite complex, I opted to not delve into this piece of my interviews, but felt it was pertinent information to share. It is undeniable that an opioid crisis is directly affecting the populations of people spoken of in this presentation. Staff turnover and lack of qualified professionals was also mentioned by all of the physicians I interviewed. With a nursing shortage and the danger involved with psychiatric care, it is often difficult for inpatient mental health care institutions to maintain adequate staff. Finally, the number of recurrent patients were also palpable in my interviews. Many people seen at WellFund have been hospitalized there numerous times and been hospitalized in one of the local institutions many more times. With so many patients clearly unable to maintain stable care and income, one is led to wonder if a lack of long-term care is at fault for these rehospitalizations. Though I wish my presentation was able to give us a solution to this growing population of homeless persons in our community, I instead settled on a conclusion that altogether feels much less final. Homelessness and in-turn poverty are not issues solved by singular initiatives or solutions. These topics are deeply complex and rooted in systemic prejudice. So-called solutions seem to be ineffective, for they aim to aid the already homeless population while ignoring one of the major root causes. Legislation and reform must shift focus to improving the mental health care systems in Washington, if we have any hope of decreasing the homeless population. If those facing severe mental illness can be provided with quality long-term care, their risk for disenfranchisement and poverty can and will rise. Additionally, by decreasing overall stigma around economic insecurity and mental illness, our society can move towards providing assistance to those in need, long before they face job loss, eviction, and eventually housing insecurity. This issue is far from being solved, but it can be helped if each person in this room makes a commitment to continuing their education around this issue, staying updated on news surrounding housing legislation, and supporting organizations helping those facing homelessness and mental illness. Thank you everyone for sharing your time with me and listening to this presentation. If you are interested in learning more about this issue or contributing to helping those facing homelessness or mental illness, I encourage you to look into volunteering for some of the local organizations I mentioned earlier in my presentation and scan the QR codes on the screen. So, Alliance for a Healthy Washington is linked right here. I looked into it. They are one of the main groups here working towards hopefully getting some more long-term mental health care access here in Washington State. And then, of course, Tacoma Rescue Mission, which we all in this room who go to school here know about and have worked there before. But as Lexi said, it's a really great organization. I've worked there a couple of times. I've talked to many of them. They are really big about helping with housing insecurity here and also helping the mentally ill population and providing food support. Also, being politically active and just politically aware is always really important with issues like this, because when we hear about legislation around homelessness, we need to know what we're talking about and be willing to vote and get out there and voice our opinions about these things, because being politically aware, like politics will define this, and if we don't have an understanding of what's going on in the political landscape going forward, we're also not going to have an understanding of what's going on within homelessness, housing insecurity, and the economy. And then just continuing to educate yourself around these issues, not only homelessness, but mental illness. As I think Owen said earlier, and we also had some other mention kind of from JoJo, mental illness is really stigmatized, and if we don't have an understanding of the people we're talking about when we talk about mental illness, we're unable to understand the issue. And also, when we separate those people from ourselves and don't understand that they are human beings just like all of us who are struggling and are in need of our help and our understanding, we separate them and then in turn separate the issue. Thank you guys.
Up next, we have our last presentation by Rowan. We'll do it at then.
Good evening. My name is Isabella Rosario, and the topic that I chose for my capstone project is the impact of extracurricular activities on the student life. The project that I chose was a survey-based research project on the impact of mental health that extracurricular activities have on students, specifically at Bellarmine. My goal was to understand how and why these activities have such an impact. Typically, we choose to participate in these activities, and usually we make us happy and we choose them. But that doesn't always mean that they're perfect. They take up much of our time and energy, and that can impact us negatively. But because of the social aspect, the fact that we want to choose to spend our time doing things that we like, that can positively impact our life. So why did I choose this project? I chose it because I, like many of the students here at Bellarmine, participate in extracurricular activities, both for fun and for my college applications, and have seen it both negatively and positively impact my own mental health and that of the people around me. I wanted to understand why these activities can have such an impact on us, what factors influence how much they affect us, and how they make others feel. So I have a little audience participation. I want you to turn to someone for a few seconds and talk about any activities that you participate in outside of work or school. It could be a sport, club, going to the gym, participating in a music group, volunteering, even going for walks, anything that you don't have to do but choose to dedicate your time and energy to. Now I want you to explain why. Why did you choose to spend your time doing this, and why do you choose to participate in this particular activity? And how does this activity make you feel while doing it? Okay. Adolescence is or was a formative stage in life for us all. Because of that fact, physical, emotional, and social changes like poverty, abuse, or violence are very impactful on the mental health of this age group. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in every 7 adolescents in the ages of 10 to 19 will experience some kind of mental illness, as you can see from the graphic on the left. That means that for this age group, that's 13% of the global burden of disease. Depression, anxiety, and behavioral disorders are the leading causes of illness and disability in this age group, and the 4th leading cause of death among those ages 15 to 29 is suicide. The consequences of not addressing these conditions in adolescence can impair a person mentally as well as physically, and this can limit some opportunities to live a fulfilling life as an adult. By the time we graduate from high school, we will have spent about 15,000 hours in school, which means that schools play a significant role in the mental health of students just based off the amount of time we spend there. Adding on the amount of time spent on extracurricular activities, something we dedicate time to not just on school days, but weekends, holidays, and summers as well, that also plays a significant part in our development. According to a 2023 study, which examined the longitudinal effect over 4 years of extracurricular activities on a sense of belonging in school and mood on students, higher school belonging reinforced positive mental health outcomes. So the more activities that students participated in, the better their mental health. Both the direct and indirect effect of extracurricular activities were impacted by lower socioeconomic status. Students residing in communities with lower socioeconomic status benefited the most from participating in activities, despite having the lowest levels of participation. The data collected in the study highlighted the participation in extracurricular activities promotes well-being, especially in more disadvantaged communities. Like I said earlier, my project was survey-based, and the students that I asked to participate in my survey were any students who attended Bellarmine last school year and participated in any sort of extracurricular activity with Bellarmine offers. I chose to have this narrow group because it allowed me to assess the results more easily, and I received 22 choices. The first question that I asked was what activities students participated in. Unsurprisingly, the majority of students participated in some kind of sport. In 2022 to 2023 school year, 7.8 million high school students participated in a sport as reported by the High School Athletics Participation Survey. An estimated 1 in every 5 U.S. adults live with a mental illness, which is about 23% of the population. When I asked students if they know of any family history of mental illness, half said yes. Mental illnesses can, in some cases, be genetic, and understanding the percentage of those who know a family member who has suffered from mental illness is important to understand why a student may suffer as well. Students reported that their families suffered with depression, eating disorders, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and PTSD. The main mental illnesses students reported their families suffering from were depression and anxiety. As I mentioned earlier in my literature review, some of the most common mental illnesses in adolescents are anxiety disorders, depression, ADHD, and eating disorders. Symptoms of anxiety disorders nearly doubled during the first year of the pandemic, and depression occurs in about 13% of youth from the ages of 12 to 17. ADHD occurs in about 9% of adolescents, and eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder occur in approximately 3%. Given that, it comes as no surprise that the majority of students surveyed said that they suffer or suffered from some form of anxiety. Depression and eating disorders also took a large majority. In my last slide, I mentioned that mental illnesses can be genetic, but not always. And I also mentioned that the main illnesses that students' families suffered from were anxiety. In many cultures, it is taboo to talk about mental health. Many feel embarrassed, haven't been exposed to it. Sometimes they feel guilty for having mental illness. While stereotypes are something we try not to fall into, we still do. and often those with mental illnesses, even if they aren't terrible people, can seem flawed to those who don't understand, both by those who they are related to and those who they hurt. I ask this question to understand if students who suffered but did not receive any form of care may also have been influenced by their own family and their ability to ask for help. Their understanding of the topic of mental health, those who suffer from mental illnesses, and their own families understand. Not asking for help can often make the problem worse, especially when those around a person suffering have views that portray mental illnesses and those who suffer from them in a negative way. Ask students what made them happy about participating in extracurricular activities, what positively impacted them and kept them coming back. They answered that it was the people, their friends who care about them, meeting new people, keeping them busy, giving them a time to clear their mind of the things that worry them, overall satisfying them, giving them a time to exercise, indulge in their interests, and involving them in their community. One student answered, better friends equals a better mindset. When asked how they feel about the activities that they participate in, students said that they feel happy, welcome, accomplished, and rewarded. One student explained that knowing how to manage their activities made them much more rewarding. Some students said that they enjoy them, but they also cause stress or drain them. When asked about the negative impacts of their activities, the majority explained that they felt stressed or anxious because they had little time left over for homework or other interests. However, one student mentioned that they couldn't see any negative impacts of their extracurricular activities. When asked if the answers to the questions of negative and positive impacts were due to the activity itself or the people involved, the majority said both. Our mental health can be impacted by our experiences, our environment, and when asked if the time commitment impacted them, an overwhelming 77% said yes. Whether the time commitments are impacting our personal and academic lives, or dynamics between peers are causing more stress, these factors can cause one who isn't already suffering to be impacted by mental illness, and those who already do struggle more. Students answered that during the pandemic, their mental health was impacted by their lack of activities. They were limited in their ability to have social contact with their friends or make new ones. Extracurricular activities aren't bad or good. They, like anything else, can have their positive and negative sides. After this project, I've learned how and why these activities can have such an effect on my age group. It's because of not only environmental factors like dynamics between peers or time commitments, but also because of our own history of mental illness, both within ourselves and our families, and our views or the views others have on mental illnesses, those who experience them, and if it is or isn't something that should or can be openly discussed, even in a family. I'd like to add one last comment from the student survey. The most important thing to me in an extracurricular is a positive environment and the feeling that I am important to the group or team. Thank you.
In countries excluding the U.S., a lot of students are in school for a much longer period of time and then have less time for a lot of extracurriculars. What are your 2 cents on how this affects their mental health and usage of positive and negative impact of that?
I would say it definitely depends on both what activities that they are able to participate in outside of school and how much pressure and how much work that they have to put in school.
Any questions for Katie? Okay, no. Okay, you can always approach her at the end too. So, all right, thank you so much everyone for coming, especially thank you to our seniors. Can we do one last round of applause for all of our seniors?